Joining me now is National Senator Matt Canavan. Matt, thanks for joining me. I understand Peter Dutton's policy that there's no point going for targets at 2030, which the government's not going to meet their targets. It's only crippling our energy grid, raising prices. So we'll give ourselves the time to get to 2050, net zero, we can put in nuclear, etc. But why don't they just ditch net zero altogether? I mean, it's not going to change the temperature of the planet. Why doesn't the coalition go that far?
Well, I agree with you, James, and I've been beating this drum ever since we signed up to net zero. And let's just take stock here of what's happened in the past few years. We signed up as a nation to this net zero by 2050 target in late 2021. So that was now 2.5 years ago. And since that time, inflation has been at record levels. Interest rates have gone up 13 times. And everything seems to have gotten so much more expensive. Now, we were promised when we signed up to net zero emissions that interest rates would go down in Australia because we'd be flooded with investor capital desperate to invest in a country committed to net zero emissions, and that would push downward pressure on the cost of capital. I was pillory at the time for disputing that. But the evidence is very clear that all that net zero has done is hampered our productivity. This net zero emissions target is a massive handbrake on our nation's economy. And we've had the worst productivity growth in our nation's history. It's not been growing, it's been declining. And that means real wages go backwards. When your productivity declines, your wages, your standard of living goes backwards. And now real wages are back to a level we hadn't seen since 2011. So since we signed the net zero emissions, our standard of living has gone back more than a decade. And so I think the science is in. This is not working. It's holding back our economy. And what we need to do right now is remove the green tape, remove the restrictions, and focus on unleashing Australia's economic potential so that young people in particular can have a future where they can afford to buy a home and start a family.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're impoverishing ourselves to make zero difference to the planet. Now, Anthony Albanese has attacked the coalition's energy policy. Have a listen to what he said this afternoon.
His nuclear fantasy will result in higher power prices and more unstable energy grid and rising emissions. No 2030 target means walking out of the Paris Agreement. That is very clear. And if you walk out of the Paris Agreement, you're left standing with Libya, Yemen and Iran. That is not the company that Australia should want to keep.
I got to admit, Matt, I listened to that and I just laughed. We're going to be left standing with Yemen, Libya and Iran. That's not the company you want to keep. I mean, I really don't think Australians are sitting there thinking, you know what, I'm prepared to pay a lot of money for my electricity as long as we're not standing with Yemen and Iran. But then Albanese goes on to say, you know, nuclear is going to put the price of electricity up and risk blackouts. Isn't that what his renewable policy is doing?
Well, I suppose if you're being sympathetic to the Prime Minister, you would give him the fact that he is the expert at pushing power prices up.
Indeed.
He knows how to do that. He's been very successful at that. He promised at the last election to cut your power bills by $275. Indeed, he made that promise almost 100 times to the Australian people. That promise was to reduce your bills by that amount by next financial year. That is, in a few weeks' time. That promise is going to be broken, of course. And so I think the Australian people will be able to see at the next election, are we better off than we were a few years ago when Anthony Albanese made these promises? And therefore, should we listen to this bloke again who lied to us last time and is now trying to scare us with this ridiculous scare campaign? The reality, James, is that a major report out last year, just before the latest climate change conference was held, showed that not a single developed country in the world, not a single country in the G20, in fact, so not one of the biggest 20 economies in the world, was on track to meet net zero emissions. And so we are the pariah if we continue to go down this absurd path where we're seeking to, in one generation, fundamentally change how we make and grow and do everything, transport ourselves, everything. That's a pretty radical position, I would have thought, to try and do that in just a generation. If we keep trying to do that, we're the ones out of step. And it's not just China and India. The European Union have been reopening coal-fired power stations since Ukraine. Last year, the United States of America produced more oil than any country ever had in 1 year. And so we are the ones out of step here, stopping our gas developments, closing down our coal mines, effectively handicapping our own economy and making us all poorer because of it, and there's no difference to the environment.
Well, you're absolutely right. And Matt, there's hardly a topic more important than energy because, I mean, it affects everything. And the level of communication from the government on this subject is so infantile as to be depressing. Have a listen to some more of what the Prime Minister said this afternoon.
Peter Dutton is divisive, the coalition are divided, and there's no detail about what they would pursue. They're the 3 Ds of the coalition: divisive, divided, detail, which gives them a big F for fail when it comes to climate policy.
Honestly, no argument, no logic, no respect for the public's intelligence, just mindless repetition of inane phrases as if his ability to alliterate somehow proves his ability to run the country. I mean, it's just depressing, the level of conversation.
Well, if I was in Anthony Albanese's office right after that, I'd be telling the Prime Minister, now, next time, Prime Minister, let's do it with passion. Next time, let's actually show a bit of passion behind it, because it was so stilted that I hadn't heard that before, but
Matt,
I couldn't stop laughing. I apologise to the Office of Prime Minister, but it's just so, as you say, it's infantile. The Anthony Albanese was a student politician, of course, and it's not really risen above that. I think the Australian people are doing it really tough right now, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe sometimes you need to have these really simple lines and be very simple in communication, because people have got other things to worry about in their lives. But right now, they are very concerned about the cost of living. They are concerned about the tensions in our geopolitical tensions in our region. And I think they're open to having a more adult conversation from some real leaders about what it takes in tough times to make things better. Because right now, things aren't getting better under Anthony Albanese, of course. We're getting weaker as a nation. And just at a time when the threat of conflict in our region is rising, we are destroying our manufacturing base and making it very hard to do business in this country. So I really do think that there's fertile ground here for a courageous political leader to take the banner up here, take the fight up in favour of our nation, and smash through these ridiculous arguments that are being put to the Australian people. I think the Australian people are much smarter than the Prime Minister gives them credit for.
Absolutely. I listened to the Prime Minister and I'm listening to what he's saying and thinking, you know what, I reckon he should spend $300,000 on a speechwriter as well, just like Bill Shorten has. Matt, just quickly before I let you go, the Liberal Party's been wargaming an early election scenario, submitting 100 policies or so to the Parliamentary Budget Office for costings. Just quickly, how likely do you think an early election is?
Look, it's possible. Obviously, it would be a huge gamble for the Prime Minister, because I think, like the polls say, I think it's pretty tight, pretty close out there. I think this government's on thin ice. It's on thin ice because it has not been able to help Australians with their standard of living. And then we've seen perhaps the most shocking scandal, political scandal in a generation unfold in the last few weeks, where a government has presided over the release, or if you like, the keeping in our own country of people who have committed the most heinous crimes of violence against their own parties, against their own family, young children, and there's no accountability. And the Prime Minister looks really weak here, and I felt that listening to that grab from the Prime Minister, that he just sounds not very confident in himself. And as I say, I think the Australian people want someone who can show a bit more leadership right now, rather than these trite, obviously well-trodden attack lines that are beneath the office of Prime Minister. So look, let's hope he refines his voice for our country, but I don't think he's in a great state to go to an early election. And if he wants to do that, bring it on. Let's bring it on. Let's let the Australian people have their say. I want it to be sooner rather than later.
Well, I think we all want it sooner rather than later. Matt Canavan, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.